Greetings and welcome to the National Adaptation Forum webinar, Climate Equity is Climate Smart. My name is Lauren and I will be helping run the webinar today. The National Adaptation Forum webinar series are run quarterly so we can continue discussing how to move adaptation forward between our biannual gatherings. If you would like to recommend a topic or are interested in participating with the National Adaptation Forum webinar series and co-hosting a webinar, please email us at info@nationaladaptationforum.org. Before we get started, I would like to go through some housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. Please place telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute. This will help reduce the feedback. If you are using a microphone voice over IP option, please ensure you place your computer on mute even if you are listening while muted. We will have plenty of time after the presentation for questions and answers. Throughout the webinar, you can use the question function to submit questions to the presenters. We will do our best to answer all of them. You can also raise your hand and we will call on you and unmute you to ask you a question or to have you ask a question directly to our presenters. You can use the chat function to report any technical issues or problems you might have. We'll try our best to address any problems. The chat function can also be used to communicate between attendees as a way to emphasize a point heard during the presentation. We encourage you to engage with your fellow colleagues that way. Finally, I would like to let you know that we will be recording and posting the webinar in the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing. They should be available online next week and can be viewed at cakex.org. Presentations will also be available online as PDFs on EcoAdapt site at ecoadapt.org/webinar. The overview for today's webinar is that climate change impacts all of us. However, low-income communities and communities of color are often hurt worst and first. In these communities, climate change is a complicating environmental challenge stacked on top of histories of pollution, disinvestment, and discrimination. Today, our moderator will be Lida El-Jabbar. She is the Climate Cities Program Manager at the Trust for Public Land. Based in New York City, Lida manages local partnerships and provides technical assistance for climate change planning and green infrastructure implementation in cities across the U.S. Lida worked as a city planner specializing in park, public space, and land use for Arlington, Virginia in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Lida has also conducted community-based development research for the Punta Cana Ecological Foundation in the Dominican Republic, analyzed economic and racial equity trends at the Green Lining Institute in Berkeley, California, and helped develop local land and agricultural preservation policy at the New River Land Trust in Southwest Virginia. She holds a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning and a graduate certificate in Natural Resources from the Center for Leadership in Global Sustainability at Virginia Tech. Lida has the BA in Public and Urban Affairs with a minor in Landscape Architecture, also from Virginia Tech. And Lida will lead us through the rest of the panelists for today. Take it away, Lida.
Thank you. So thank you so much to National Adaptation Forum for the opportunity to have this conversation and revisit and extend this conversation with a broader audience with these great panelists today. In this hour, we'll be extending this conversation around equitable climate action with a focus on applying these concepts of equity and justice into practice for on-the-ground solutions. So I'm really lucky to be joined today by an inspiring group of climate action and adaptation leaders who are working across the country to ensure a just and equitable future in a changing climate. Chad Daly is a nationally recognized expert on forest conservation, restoration, and urban greening for almost 2 decades leading diverse forest sector coalitions and partnerships. He oversees American forest programs in these areas, and he comes to American Forest from a 9-year stint at the Trust for Public Land, where he created the Climate Smart Cities program. Chris David is a Climate GIS Program Manager at the Trust for Public Land, where he works with technical experts and partnership cities to build GIS decision support tools, helping governments and NGOs identify and prioritize multiple benefit green infrastructure implementation. Jackie Patterson is the Senior Director of the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She has worked with Peace Corps, IMA World Health, and ActionAid International. She's co-founded Women of Color United and serves on serves on the boards of directors for many organizations, but among them, the Institute of the Black World, the National Black Workers Center, Grid Alternatives, Association of Adaptation Professionals. And Laura Gracia Santiago is the Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Enhancement, or CARE coordinator at Communities for a Better Environment. She, prior to that, was the Richmond Youth Organizer, where she developed CBE's Richmond Youth for Environmental Justice program. She has volunteered in Canvas for Planned Parenthood, mentored and tutored young migrants in California, and improved transportation for students and workers at UC Santa Barbara. Next slide. So as it's been noted, we understand that climate change impacts all of us, but of course, low-income communities and communities of color are often hurt first and worst. So these are complicated environmental challenges intersecting with socioeconomic, political, and other challenges in these communities. Next slide. Among other impacts, we know that low-income communities often incur the greatest financial damages from severe weather and flooding. Next slide. Heat-related illness is already the leading cause of death in the United States, particularly among children, the elderly, and people with pre-existing health conditions. And extreme heat days are expected to increase with a warming planet. Next slide. Mobility continues to be a challenge among low-income communities, and access to safe, alternative, and active transportation options will be a rising need with both climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. Next slide. And in knowing these complex and interconnected challenges, just a few among the many that we're expecting, many of us among the adaptation community and climate action community have come to understand that conventional responses to climate change don't often work on their own, and they typically don't work for everyone. So it's understood that no investment in infrastructure or other climate adaptation measure, for that matter, is ever really neutral. So the terms equity and justice have gained prominence in the climate action community. But the question is, how can we ensure that these concepts of equity, justice, and fairness are actually translate into action and don't ultimately meet the fate of other common buzzwords? Next slide. So it was with some of these thoughts in mind, by way of background, that several of us had convened a panel discussion last year at the National Adaptation Forum in St. Paul, Minnesota, many of the folks who you'll hear from today. At that session, we had discussed some of the differences between climate justice and climate equity, the role of communities and residents as experts in climate planning and action, and the need to work across our various governmental and disciplinary silos. We also heard a lot from attendees in the session and in the very lively discussion that followed our presentations. We heard about the need to address the very real threats of gentrification and displacement in many communities, about the need not to ignore the root causes of our challenges in climate change and climate adaptation, and about how we cannot mistake activity on climate action for success in climate equity and climate action. So this conversation today will emphasize and extend on these topics, focusing again on translating these concepts into practice. So with that, I'm going to share the stage with my panelists who will give brief presentations of their work before we head into a discussion and take your questions. Chad?
Great. Thanks so much, Lita. It's a real honor to be back together with this panel, and we really appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. Next slide, please. So I want to just speak very briefly about how we think about these issues at American Forest, and in particular through the work of our Community Relief Program, which is our urban program to help spread a healthy, resilient tree canopy across cities all across North America. Next slide, please. Just a quick word about American Forests. If you're not familiar with our organization, we're actually the oldest forest conservation organization in the country, and that has always included work in cities. For over 100 years, we've been working from the birth of the urban forest movement to find different ways to create more capacity and more understanding of the importance of urban forests and to help empower communities in creating urban forests. And that includes things like working with the Forest Service and helping create the Urban and Community Forestry Program at the Forest Service that provides funding for this work all across the country, and leadership in GIS analysis to help identify the needs for urban forests across the country, and many other similar activities. Next slide, please. So our program is actually centered in exactly what we're here to talk about today. If you want to map equity in America, if you want to map inequity in America, a great place to start is by mapping tree canopy cover. And if you look at this map here on the right of my home area of DC, where our organization is headquartered, you'll see that the map of the tree canopy in this region is a pretty perfect map of the income disparities across the region as well. Low-income areas have dramatically less tree canopy cover. And as we've seen in DC and in other communities across America, if we were mapping instead showing the correlation of tree canopy cover to communities of color, we would see some of these same significant and insupportable disparities in the tree canopy cover in neighborhoods across America. So our program is really centered on focusing our energies with our partners in cities to remedy these inequities, to bring tree equity to cities across the country. Next slide. But we're here today to talk about climate equity, and so I want to talk about the link between that broad goal of helping cities achieve tree equity to how that relates to climate equity. I'd love to spend 20 minutes giving you the laundry list of all the reasons why trees are critically important to the health and well-being of people. But I want to focus in on the one that Lita mentioned earlier that we think is the most significant driver of climate risk for people in cities, and that's extreme heat. And extreme heat not only creates heat-related illness, but as folks are probably well aware, heat also cooks air pollution. So there's really a double whammy of health stress on people from extreme heat. And if you live in an area in cities, if you live in an area that's in an urban heat island in the city, you're in a place that's dramatically exacerbating the exposure to heat risk. And we all understand that as climate change elevates heat-related heat incidents and heat risk across the country, that the inequities associated with living in one of these high heat areas, one of these urban heat islands, is going to be a significant driver of climate inequity into the future. So as we see it, using tree canopy cover as a way of remedying urban heat islands and lessening urban heat risk is one of the most critical things that we can do to increase climate equity. And I think this map that you see here showing the almost perfect correlation of the high heat areas and the areas with low tree canopy cover gives you a sense of just how important trees are as a direct solution to reducing urban heat islands. Next slide, please. And so something that we've really challenged ourselves on, we want to challenge the community on, is that as we do this work, we need to be doing this work with communities and doing this work, particularly for us as a national organization, doing our work in a way that's about building capacity for communities to carry this work forward over the long term. So our goal isn't for American Forest to open up an office in every city across the country. It's really for us to partner with cities in a focused engagement to identify what community groups and city leaders need to do this work to achieve tree equity over the long term and to help them build those capacities to carry this work forward. So just for today's conversation, we'd really put that out as an anchor point for the conversation. Are we building capacity for communities to lead this work into the future in the way that we provide resources and share our expertise? Next slide. And these are just examples of a very, very small sample of the kinds of organizations, city governments and community-based organizations that we've worked with all across the country in this type of work. These are the kinds of folks that we want to help provide capacity to lead this work into the future. Next slide. And then in closing, I want to put just one other thought into the conversation today, which is that we're strongly of the belief that as we're investing money in communities on issues like tree canopy cover and other urban greening, we have to link that to the broadest range of needs in these communities for achieving greater equity. And we think that the most cross-cutting and pressing equity issue in these communities is around economic opportunity. So one of the things that we're really excited about, and we're investing in a whole new partnership effort on nationally, is to link the work that we're doing in partnership with community-based organizations to new workforce development opportunities in urban forestry. It's a fast-growing economic sector that has a significant workforce shortage. And so we're challenging ourselves to ask, how can we, in the process of engaging with community-based partners, create a ladder of economic opportunity for interested people in underserved communities to be part of this fast-growing area of employment, doing this really important work of advancing tree equity. And we think that offers a kind of a synergy of the type of equity benefits that we're all here to talk about today. Thanks.
Thank you, Jad. Jackie?
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. Next slide. So I'll just go next because there's so many. I don't want to waste an extra word, but is there? Are we okay with this? Okay, great. So I'll be talking a little bit about the way we view equity and resilience building for climate adaptation, and a little bit about some of the recent initiatives that we are advancing on the same. Next. Okay, so first I wanted to remind us of what our human and civil rights are, because we view a lot of these equity issues through the lens of human and civil rights, and this is just a list of what those are, and I believe actually that they have recently incorporated the right to water, clean and safe water, as a human right as well within the United Nations. Next slide. And so, okay, yeah. So first, yeah, sorry, I feel like there was something. Okay, good, yeah, all right. So first, talking about some of the ways that we see intersectionality as an important place is an important lens as we think about building equity and building resilience in the context of climate adaptation. I want to give some examples of some of the. Is it advancing by itself? Oh, okay, all right, good, sorry. So I want to give examples of some of the ways that we view this intersectionality, looking at issues of economic status, political power, education, gender, race, immigration status, and the list goes on in terms of ways that certain communities are differentially impacted, certain populations within the disproportionate impact of communities of color and low-income communities face in the context of climate change. Next. And so one example is the ways that certain communities are viewed and what that means in terms of how they are treated in the context of some of the climate impacts. This is an image of the same news outlet, two stories but told in different ways. When there were white people featured in the image, it was two residents wade through chest-deep waters after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina. But then when it was an African-American young man, it was a young man wade through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And that image gives a sense of how those different perceptions lead to racial profiling, police brutality, criminalization, and even state-sponsored murder, as we saw with the folks who were shot on the Danziger Bridge after Hurricane Katrina. This next image talks about some of the ways that is emblematic of the gendered impacts of climate change and the ways that women are disproportionately impacted, including women facing violence against women disproportionately, women who are in the agricultural industry or who are responsible for bringing food home for their families, having to walk further to get water and so forth. And this image particularly has two women from the Philippines who were at the UN climate talks, with the person in the center who is from Gulfport, Mississippi. All three of them share in common having to flee their homes in the context of major historic storms. With the two women, it's Super Typhoon Haiyan, and the woman in the center is, of course, Hurricane Katrina. Next. And when we see, whether it's in around the world, all the folks who are being driven from their homelands because of the disasters that happen, but yet we are starting disasters and other impacts. But yet we, as the United States, are having an increasingly punitive and restrictive immigration policies, even though we're 4% of the global population and 25% of the pollution that drives climate change. Next. And also we see the intersectionality of and sorry for that, I think there was some loss in translation in terms of the slides. So sorry, it looks a little bit messy. It doesn't look like that originally, believe me. And when we talk, even as we try to advance climate adaptation, the ways that it's actually impacting and displacing certain communities is important for us to think about as we talk about building resilience. That some of the very measures that we take to respond to climate change aren't ones that actually make things worse for communities that are already disproportionately impacted. Next. And this is a quote from Martin Luther King to just amplify: I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. Next. And so this is just a indicators framework around how we view equity and building equity in the context of climate adaptation. I won't go through these. Next. And with that, we want to make sure that we're building what resilience looks like. And a lot of times when we talk about climate adaptation and talk about resilience, it might be in the form of infrastructure, and not necessarily thinking about some of the social, political, economic, and other building that we need to do in order to actually have resilience. Next. So we have this framework that the Climate Justice Alliance, of which we're a part, and many other frontline community groups that talk about the types of transition that we as a society need to make in order to have a sustainable planet with resilience and with survival, and not only just surviving, but actually thriving. So moving away from an extractive economy to a living economy. Next. And the components of that living economy that's resilient include community self-determination, deep democracy, mutuality and cooperation, regenerative systems, ecological and social well-being. Next. And so I'm going to end with this because the slide transfer is going, I usually kind of zip through. So I think we'll just mercifully end. But just ending on these three upcoming NAACP resources that are coming through. One is a climate adaptation finance training that we are putting together. For those who are familiar, we have energy justice training that we do and certification program. And we're going to be doing the same thing with climate adaptation finance in partnership with Sustainable Capital Advisors. So it'll be a 3-day training. We'll also have a fleet of interns that will be working with Sustainable Capital Advisors to develop analyses and tools for the use of frontline community groups who are advocating for equitable ways of implementing climate finance, et cetera. We are also in the next couple of weeks coming out with an equity and emergency management toolkit, and that will include ways that that communities can be at the table in their emergency management planning processes to make sure that the way from preparation and mitigation to recovery and redevelopment at every stage that we are centering equity in how we design those policies and practices. And then we're also doing a climate resilience and adaptation toolkit that's a broader toolkit that includes everything from sea level rise to shifts in agricultural yields to disasters, and ways that we can have a policy and practice platform that uplifts community leadership and decision making and really goes back to that infographic in terms of bending that arc away from extraction and exploitation towards cooperative communities that embody deep democracy. So thank you. Yeah, we'll end now.
Thank you, Jackie.
Sure.
Chris, we'll be coming up to your slide in a moment. We'll transition to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Lita, and thanks everyone for having me in the Trust for Public Land. I wanted to note that I'm filling in today for my colleague Fernando Cazares, who's actually, I think this is relevant, in Sacramento, testifying at the State House in support of a statewide bill to establish a program that enhances the capacity for underserved communities to gain more access to climate and other competitive grants. So I'm sorry he couldn't be here, but I'll try to fill in for him. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about the Trust for Public Land, and in particular how the Climate Smart Cities program is thinking about equity and learning about equity as we go. So just a quick word about the Trust for Public Land. We create parks and protect land for people, ensuring healthy, livable communities for generations to come. To that end, next slide. We believe everyone deserves to live within a 10-minute walk of a high-quality park. We believe parks are a tool to fight inequities by shifting investment in public space to those areas in the greatest need. With thoughtful, inclusive design, they can promote healthy lifestyles, foster social and community cohesion, and provide a variety of environmental and climate benefits. With limited resources to address climate, health, resilience, it's imperative that we make better decisions that prioritize projects, stacking these benefits on top of each other to provide the greatest return on investment for people. Next slide. To borrow a phrase from Freddie Collier, the planning director for the city of Cleveland and a panelist at this session at the National Adaptation Forum last year, equity has become our central value proposition for the Climate Smart Cities program. To be effective addressing equity, we're learning it must be the starting place for all of the work that we do across the country. Our tools and planning efforts focus on driving investment to where climate exposures and priorities intersect with at-risk or sensitive communities. These climate priorities include, next slide, safely and comfortably connecting people to places by bike or on foot, cooling neighborhoods through strategic street tree planting and other green space, absorbing stormwater to minimize flooding and reducing the strain on the stormwater system, and protecting neighborhoods and critical infrastructure from coastal storms through green buffers. Next slide. We're doing this work across the country and at various stages of development. Next slide. Let's see if it's making it there. Thank you. We're at various stages of development or technical assistance with about 20 cities across the country. Today, we're going to highlight our work in New Orleans, but feel free to reach out after the webinar to learn more about what's happening in any of these cities. Next slide. So New Orleans, a city, and as you all know, very rich in culture, but also exemplifies the confluence of economic, environmental, and social challenges that plague many cities. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, for example, income disparities across racial lines have increased, leaving poor minority populations in the crosshairs of not only catastrophic storms, but also many everyday climate risks, whether it's flooding from more common storms or spiking temperatures during a heat wave. Next slide. To support the city's efforts to reduce the stresses of climate change and extreme events through targeted investment in communities and inclusive planning, our integrated approach of the Climate Smart Cities program is catalyzing new green infrastructure investment in a few ways, through innovative partnerships like our research work with the Louisiana Public Health Institute, helping to identify populations with health conditions that could be exacerbated through climate change, cross-sector and cross-agency collaborative planning and data analysis for better decision-making through democratized data in a publicly available decision support tool, inclusive community storytelling and data collection through the IC Change platform, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and demonstrating the multiple benefits of community green space and things like green infrastructure schoolyards. Next slide. So just a couple of quick examples. On the left is a student-designed charrette at the Paul Havens Charter School in New Orleans. I love this picture. You know, when it rained at this on this site at this school, the field was a mud pit that spilled water with trash, mud, and other pollutants out into the streets. Given the need also in the area for more parkland in the surrounding neighborhood, which is, by the way, a low-income area where the majority of people are at a high risk for flooding, the Trust for Public Land worked with local communities and students at the school to develop a green infrastructure playground that will be able to infiltrate over an inch of water from any storm event on site and through the surrounding neighborhood, while providing safe educational and fun space for students during the school day and the entire community outside of school hours. On the right-hand side is the St. Bernard campus. Armed with knowledge of flooding and extreme heat in an underserved community, through support from the Trust for Public Lands Decision Support Tool, this site, which is adjacent to a public housing facility, was selected by the city as one of its signature green infrastructure projects for HUD's Natural Disaster Resilience Award. After reviewing the new health data that I mentioned earlier that the Trust for Public Land worked on with the Louisiana Public Health Institute and was incorporated into our decision support tool for New Orleans, the city realized the critical importance of incorporating health into their planning for the site. While still in the planning stages now, we're excited about the multiple community benefits this project will provide to residents. Next slide. But big data, and I put big in quotes there, only gets you so far. We need to find better ways to learn from the community, who are the experts on their community, well before projects are identified. We're still learning how best to engage community members and incorporate their input into decision-making, but we're making some progress. In New Orleans, in partnership with IC Change, we've used community storytelling events and an easily accessible platform for citizen science and reporting weather events to engage and empower residents to shape their community's response to climate change. Efforts must be baked into the process from the start for the best chances of success. We don't have all of the answers here, but as I mentioned, we are learning and hope to continue to learn. Looking forward to hearing your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Laura?
Hi, everyone. Just as a quick correction, I worked on transportation with workers at the University of California in Santa Cruz. Not Santa Barbara. But thank you all for participating in this webinar. Thank you for inviting me, and it's been a very valuable experience. So I'm going to quickly talk a little bit about CBE. So Communities for a Better Environment is a statewide environmental justice organization. We work to build people power in low-income communities of color. We work out of 4 communities, one in Richmond, East Oakland, Southeast LA, and Wilmington. Next slide, please. That's not my presentation.
One second, I'm
sorry. Oh, it's okay. No, it's fine. I'll talk in the meantime. So the very first slide says system change, not climate change. And so I'm sharing it with all of you. That's a chant that's often used. As mentioned earlier, my background is in organizing. Right before starting this adaptation and resiliency work, I was a youth organizer in Richmond. And so I wanted to share this chant with you all so that we can be grounded in the realities that we as community members, organizers, city planners, policymakers, and educators, we can't lose sight of the root cause of the extractive economy that we live in. Recognizing that the extractive economy upholds white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. So therefore, solutions must be created together with community expertise and using a just transition to move away from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy that uplifts frontline low-income communities of color. So folks don't just live, but also thrive. Thank you. You can leave it there. So just as a quick recap of just transition. So this started as a campaign for me, but I've slowly, the more I've been like talking about it, it's kind of like a lifestyle. It's like a way of thinking. It's recognizing that the people need to be at the center of all of the work that we do. So from there, we talked a little bit about moving the money. So what does it mean to move the money? There have been so many times in the past where climate adaptation and resiliency projects have allowed developers to profit and have displaced low-income people of color and specifically the African American community. So we need to, while we're building out the good in our communities, we also need to continue to do it for the folks that have lived there for generations and who won't be displaced, and they will be the ones benefiting off of the like good projects that we build out. And also the money needs to stay within the community. So like I said, people aren't just living, but they're thriving. Organizing to build the good. So climate adaptation resiliency is that, right? We're working to build the good and to be resilient and adapt in the face of climate change. Another quote that I wanted to just share with you all is our youth group down in Wilmington says, climate change starts in our hood and climate change ends in our hood. Meaning that frontline communities are not only facing the immediate dangers of extractive sources, such as refineries, neighborhood drilling, and power plants, but we're also at the front line of long-term effects of climate change because of these extractive practices. So therefore, we really need to utilize and work with community and really uphold and uplift community expertise, because while we continue to organize the bad, we need to do that alongside community members. And changing the story. So the work that we're doing is transformative, and we need to make sure that we're uplifting marginalized voices and stories that have not been shared. And we're highlighting them because they're valid, they're unique, and they share how low-income people of color have been and will continue to be resilient in the face of adversity. And we don't want to just bounce back. We want to bounce back to a more just, value-oriented, and community-driven space. Then organize a movement of movements. It's important that we recognize that folks aren't just dealing with one issue. Our communities are being resilient from all angles. So therefore, we need to plan from a holistic approach. We're organizing a movement of movements that recognizes all of the different issues that folks are dealing with in order to really, really uplift and support them. And then lastly, changing the rules. Since a lot of rules don't reflect what the community members really want or what they really envision, and so therefore we have to change some of these rules because we recognize that that most communities have not been a part of the rulemaking process, and they are facing social inequities that again arise from white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, and it's meant to criminalize people of color. So it's important that we change the rules, and we do that from a community approach, and it's community that's forming, framing, and leading this work. Can you go to the next slide, please? So an example of how we're approaching a just transition in Richmond is working via an energy policy that we formed, and we've been working with APEN, so the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. We've been, our members, our youth members, and our elders have been working together to literally like outline what this policy looks like. We sat down with folks and we asked, do we want an ordinance, a resolution? Where do we want to see solar panels? Where do we want money to go? Who should own it? Who should manage it? And folks, highlighted that they want to see the city move away from fossil fuels. If folks don't know, Richmond is home to the Chevron refinery. And so a lot of folks envision this just transition by also having the community and the city start really upholding and expanding solar energy. But again, this has to be a community-driven process to ensure that the folks that are benefiting from these new projects are the folks that have been living in this community for generations. And I just, a quick story, I was at a convening with adaptation and resiliency planners, and we were talking a little bit about energy microgrids, and someone asked me, you know, I shared that we were hoping to do a community-owned solar project, and this person was very confused, and honestly, I felt like he was a little annoyed, and he asked why, like, what's the point? And again, coming from an organizer perspective, I think in chance, it's like a weird thing that happens in my head. But in my head, I went, because nothing about us without us. And that's the point. Our community members have lived here for generations, and their expertise hasn't been uplifted, hasn't been put at the forefront. So if we're going to build out in our community, we need to make sure that that community is at the table, planning, organizing, and leading this work. And this is how we're changing the rules. So next slide, please. So basic environmental justice principles should apply to any climate adaptation resiliency project. And if y'all take anything away from this, I really hope it's this point. It's really easy to look up environmental justice principles, and you know, review them, look through them, because it's important that we really hold that near and dear our heart, like our work. In the Bay Area, there has been a recent design challenge whose goal is to develop resiliency projects in different Bay Area communities. The approach and structure of the organizers and the institution has been very problematic. Many participating CBOs don't feel comfortable, they feel tokenized, they feel their concerns have been ignored, and some have decided not to participate in a transactional structure that, again, upholds white supremacy and capitalism. The process that the institution, organizers, and design teams have outlined was not made for community engagement, ownership, and decision-making, but it is instead facilitated and will continue to support gentrification in low-income communities of color, specifically African-American communities, which is who we're working with in East Oakland. And then can you go to the next slide, please? So with that being said, it's important that we uplift community expertise, that we move towards a just transition. And we recognize that community members aren't just dealing with one issue. They're dealing with a lot, and it's that intersectionality that we need to address. And if we're going to work towards adaptation and resiliency, we need to approach it holistically. And that's just a quick example of that as well, is that our Power Coalition in Richmond, California is made up of 7 different organizations. Each organization focuses on a different subject. So going down the line of the logos here, we have some folks that work on transportation, environmental justice, food sovereignty, supporting folks who are previously incarcerated and working alongside and working. Previously incarcerated, then indigenous sovereignty and housing. So we're together working on what does a just transition look like in our communities, and bringing in all of our community members to really talk this through. So yeah, just the 3 main takeaways. Community expertise is vital. A just transition involves everyone, and it means changing the system, and then addressing issues holistically. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to each of our panelists. We're now, I believe, Whitney, I'll hand it over to you as you all manage the question and answer phase. But given that we just have 15 minutes left, we'd love to encourage you all on the line to share your questions or comments or points for discussion here. And I'll give you all a moment to provide those questions via the chat function, but maybe while you're thinking about your questions, I'd love to pose to the panelists here. We heard such a good taste of what you all are up to in terms of bringing practical tools and approaches to communities. Heard themes around building capacity for community residents and organizations, about providing economic opportunity, and about really addressing many of the intersecting challenges and challenges of institutionalized racism and patriarchy and challenges of the capitalistic system that they're all up against. But I'm curious to hear about, in delivering some of these trainings and toolkits, regarding building capacity among community members and organizations themselves. Would any of the panelists like to share a little bit, maybe dive in a tiny bit more about what you found as a successful approach to either identifying capacity needs of local communities, or what resources or strategies have you found to be most effective in supporting capacity building for community organizations?
Lita, this is Jad. Could I offer an initial thought here? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, please share, Jad.
Yeah, great, thanks. I'm going to make it really simple, which is we need to pay attention to who's getting paid. That I think there's been a historical, and I thought some of my fellow panelists did a great job of getting at this, that we've talked a lot about building capacity for community-based organizations in this work, but a lot of times it's been, through other organizations coming in and being funded and resourced to do things, with those partners or for those partners. But I think that we haven't paid enough attention to, quite frankly, the simple financial side of it, which is, are we making sure that we are creating funding that is going directly to frontline organizations so that they have the paid staff capacity to partner alongside larger organizations that have more resources. And I just think that has to be a principle that we all embrace, and certainly at American Forest, it's one of the things that we've worked really hard on is to raise funds that include really substantial funds that we are able to grant directly to our community-based partner organizations as we collaborate together. So I think that just feels to me like something as a movement we all need to continue to think about together, and to challenge all of the public and private funding sources that we draw on to provide this funding, to make sure that the resources are distributed in a way that all organizations have the kind of paid capacity, funded capacity to participate.
Thank you, Jad. Does anyone else have a point or comment on that question?
This is Chris. I'll just add to that. I mean, my thoughts were going along the same lines with your question, Lita, and my first thought is the same as yours, Jad. But one of the things that I've been thinking about as a part of a national organization is we do need to pay attention to who's getting paid, but also we need to pay attention to when we're bringing in those other community organizations into the process. These need to be co-created processes and co-created work plans and scopes, and it's not that we're bringing in this funding and this scope of work and then providing funding for others to work on it. We need to be flexible in the way that we're bringing in that money so we can co-create those types of projects with local organizations.
Hi, everyone. If I can just add a quick point. I want to uplift, this is Laura. I wanted to uplift what I believe Chris just said. So what we saw here in Oakland in the Bay Area was that this resilient project challenge this resilient challenge, it had been organized and it had been set really like a while ago. And community-based organizations were brought in, not even at halfway point. They were brought in virtually at the end when, designs were already made and the timeline was very, the timeline is right around the corner. So definitely bringing in community-based organizations at the very beginning of that process to really go through it together, and make sure that communities being impacted will be involved.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point, and it gets back to yours, Laura, about uplifting the marginalized voices and having these voices and folks leading that change. Do you have any other thoughts in terms of sort of best practices or strategies in terms of empowering these individuals to be at the forefront in leading that change on many of these activities?
I feel like best practices is honestly, if there's capacity, really just sitting down and really hearing from community. So from another recent convening that I attended, an organization in New York, they were doing door knocking every day, and they, neighbors knew the organizers. Neighbors talked amongst each other. That community is so well knit that when it comes to like organizing and mobilizing, everyone already knows each other so well, and they really understand the mission statement that they're all in it together. So something that we're organizing for is building a people's assembly, where we're asking folks to come in and really listen and sit down and really listen to what it is that community is being affected by, and what they want to prioritize in terms of how can we as a coalition support and uplift those priorities. So again, if capacity isn't, if it depends on capacity, right? So sitting down and just like really listening from community, but also to bring back what Jad was saying about making sure that funding is available for these projects. And as well as recognizing if you're a large entity and a large organization, how are you going to participate and bring in community members and community-based organizations? And also recognize the labor that goes into that.
Hi, this is Jackie. I just wanted to add to that in terms of how one concrete tool one concrete model is participatory budgeting, and we definitely need more of those kind of models to make sure that it's not just a community advisory board or even listening and kind of selective listening in terms of what the community said just reinforces what groups already wanted to do in the first place. So we've seen some of the nuances get into the particulars of how some of these things are implemented, some of these practices are implemented. And another along those same lines is making sure that we're having visioning sessions that really open the floor broadly, both to temper the fact that so many of these communities have been so under siege and oppressed by multiple things. In the first round of conversations, the conversation is often about fighting against this and fighting against that, because that's so much of what is pervasive in many of the communities that we've met with. And so then making sure that we are working on those things, but also getting beyond or adding to those by really having vision, like this is what it'll take for you to survive, but what will it take for you to thrive? So really having those kind of conversations and making sure that facilitation and structure in terms of how we facilitate community conversations is organized in such a way that we are really opening imagination in terms of possibilities for communities in a broad and deep sense. And then I'll just also end with the first point I started on in terms of a lot of times, even with community input, like the frame starts small because there's a certain project that someone comes in and they want to do, and they get all the community input about that project, as opposed to really starting with what the community wants to do and being of service to what the community wants to do. So these are some of the things that I found that result in true resilience building and longevity in planning. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. We want to save a little bit of time here at the end to answer direct questions from our participants. So our first question is for Jackie, and that is, when, where, and how can folks access the toolkits that you mentioned?
Okay, yeah, very good question. Thank you. So the emergency management, so in terms of where and how, all of these materials, all of our materials will be on our website, and we'll also, like we do for whenever we release something, we'll have a series of webinars to introduce the material and make sure walk people through it, get input in terms of thinking about the next version of whatever material we put out. So we'll be doing all of that with both of the toolkits. In terms of the when, of course, I avoided that one because that's the one that I believe the Equity Emergency Management Toolkit ideally will be coming out within the next 2 weeks, because we love to release it in time for the national meeting of the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, which is happening in the beginning of May. So we're aiming to get it out by then. The Equity and Resilience Building for Climate Adaptation Toolkit is going to be a little bit longer. I would say another couple of months, so probably by June or so. But the Equity and Emergency Management Toolkit should definitely be coming out by, let's say, mid-May at the latest.
Great, thank you. Okay,
sure,
our next question, our next question is for Jad and also for others if you want to chime in. It's kind of a two-part question. The first is that how are you, when addressing urban heat islands, how are you planning to use trees that can thrive in future climate conditions? There's some work going on at UC Davis to test tree species for California. You can find that information at climatereadytrees.ucdavis.edu. And then the second part of the question is that there's also been some success in planning the female species or gender of trees to eliminate pollen issues, which can reduce asthma triggers in low-income neighborhoods. And are you aware of any additional research on this topic?
Yeah, thanks for those. Those are great questions. I see we have 2 minutes left, so I'll try to be as concise as I can. And probably the most important thing I can say that actually helps to address both of those questions is that American Forest has a really fantastic working relationship with the Forest Service, and in particular, different research components of the Forest Service. One I want to highlight is the work out of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the USDA Climate Hubs. A couple of examples of parts of the Forest Service and of USDA more broadly that we have been working with on particularly those issues around climate adaptation of forests. And the question was really insightful because, of course, having a thriving tree canopy cover in an urban environment is more challenging environment for growing healthy trees than that out in natural landscapes. And so all the stresses and that come from climate change on trees will only be magnified, are already being only magnified in cities, and will only become more acute in the future. So we are absolutely partnering with folks who are the kind of leading thinkers on adapting our planting templates and palettes to reflect climate adaptation principles, and that's something. But it's something that we're going to be putting additional emphasis on going forward because it's so essential to success. And similarly with issues that you mentioned around dealing with pollen and other aspects really of optimizing the benefits and addressing in some cases the challenges of tree canopy cover. those are scientific aspects that we're working on as well, and we see kind of one of our key roles as an organization to engage on those scientific questions, identify the best practices and information, and then serve them back out to the community, which is maybe a final point to let folks know there's a great resource that we've partnered with the Forest Service and National Association of Regional Councils on creating, called Vibrant Cities Lab. And so if you just Google Vibrant Cities Lab or vibranttcitieslab.com, it's really a kind of a one-stop shop for all the best information on urban forestry in the U.S., and it's meant for all different kinds of practitioners. And so it's a great place to go and see, for example, on some of the questions you asked, what is the state of the science, and see all those kinds of resources gathered together in one place.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot of questions still, so if it's okay with the panelists, we'll extend beyond the 1 hour that we had allocated. Does that work?
Fine, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. So folks, stick with us if you'd like to answer and listen to additional questions. Okay, so our next question is related to gentrification, and it's for all panelists if you have any thoughts. So what do we do about the displacement and gentrification pressures that are pushing low-income individuals or communities of color outside of cities beyond where some of the work on resilience is happening? Do you have any advice on fighting gentrification while working on climate justice?
Hi, everyone, it's Laura. I can give some feedback. I do want to go back to the idea of like where is the funding coming from and where is it going? Because for example, like the transit can sometimes be a really good thing for communities, and sometimes it can also really impact our communities. I remember recently reading an article about here in Los Angeles, where this building was, built, city wants to build more housing by public transportation to make it more accessible. But developers are, this housing isn't for our communities. It's super expensive, and even if they claim to have some type of affordable housing, it's still not affordable for our communities. And so it's really important to really look into the types of planning that's going into our communities, and as well as just like resist, right? Because now not only has transit gone down in that area where that building was built, a lot of folks were displaced from that space. So I think I just need to keep going back to the fact that community needs to be present in these spaces. And we need to hold also agencies accountable. There have been similar, so many projects sprouting up that are similar to this one case in Los Angeles and in Oakland that we constantly have to be alert about what's going on. I don't know if this person is in California, but I know that one of the things that we're also working on is on repealing Costa-Hawkins here in California. Costa-Hawkins doesn't allow for rent control to apply to all housing older than a specific age. So we're working to make sure that rent control is really available to all housing.
Great, thanks. Does anyone else want to chime in on that question? Okay, so the next question we have is, much of the talk today has been about the great work going on in cities, but what about communities and rural areas? Are there any resources for addressing equity in rural locations?
This is Jad. I'd be happy to jump in and offer an initial thought. Our organization is very present in rural communities as well, and working on both forest issues, community forest issues within rural communities, but also working on forest issues around rural communities. And it's probably no surprise to so many folks on the phone that particularly the economic well-being of rural communities, which have really struggled broadly since 2008. So you've got this already challenging economy in rural communities, and as the land base that in many cases, for example, forest lands that are a critical part of powering the economy in these places, as those lands are under stress from climate change, it has a real impact on people's lives and on economic opportunity and ultimately the opportunity for equity in rural areas. And so we're involved in a number of different initiatives trying to partner deeply with communities around both addressing those essentially threats to their livelihood and well-being to their forest land base, but also thinking creatively, just like in the urban work that I described, where we're trying to think, how can we create job opportunities as part of the process of addressing tree equity in cities? We're thinking, really hard with our partners about how do we create the maximum number of economic opportunities in the process of dealing with the adaptation challenges that you find in rural areas, and there are a lot of them. The work of forest restoration, for example, it's people intensive to do that work right, and it's not work that can be outsourced. And so we think that there's a real chance that the kinds of things that we're working on and essentially implementing climate adaptation resilience practices in rural communities can be part of achieving broader equity goals in those communities.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the next question we have is, what would you consider appropriate ways for white, not low-income allies to join and contribute to the transformative work that you all do? Do you have any recommended trainings, preparations, or approaches?
Thank you. That's a great question. This is Jackie. A couple of things. One, thinking if it's kind of from an individual standpoint versus an organizational standpoint, and I have resources for both, but from an individual standpoint, there is a group called Showing Up for Racial Justice and Surge, and they have chapters throughout the country in different localities, rural and urban, and I would definitely recommend either hooking up with if there's an existing chapter or starting one, even if you feel like you're still in a formative phase and you're in desire to engage. If you start one, then you'll be a part of a community of people who are in that same phase, and then you'll have the support of the mothership of Surge nationally, and you'll be a part of a network of organizations of groups across the country who are on that same path. So I definitely recommend that. If it's an organization, then then there's groups like People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, Race Forward, and others. There's individual consultants like Angela Park. There's many who can provide guidance on how organizations can be a part of advancing racial justice in the context of this work. And I actually have a list that I've been working on of those individuals and organizations that provide that support in terms of anti-oppression, diversity, equity, inclusion, and so forth, that I can send. I don't know if there's I think we can either send it, I could send it to the organizers and we can send it out to everybody who is on this call, or I might just try to find a way to post it as a Google Doc and then send out the link. I don't know. We can talk about how to make that happen, but I'll make sure people have access to that. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, we have a lot more questions that are in the queue, but unfortunately, we have to respect everyone's time here today. And so if you have additional questions that weren't answered, we encourage you to reach out to our panelists directly. and also to engage with others on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, which is at cakex.org. And I'll turn it over to Lauren to end the webinar here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to our great panel and moderator for bringing your expertise and knowledge to the adaptation community today. This webinar has been recorded and will be on cakex.org in the coming week. And I will also download all the questions and pass those along to the panelists and see if we can get some of those answered and send that out via email. And also all of the resources that were mentioned during the question and answer period, we can make sure those get sent to you as well. So if you are looking for another National Adaptation Forum webinar, we announce those on our Twitter and on our Facebook, and our entire series is available on our website. Thanks again to our panel, and thank you all for listening today. Have a great day.